Way back in April last year, a very mysterious and seemingly ominous story began. A high-profile, prolific, and well-accomplished journalist at the height of his career and with numerous works in progress just disappeared. He had a book deal in place, he had stories he was working on, he had a very powerful position as a producer and investigative reporter at ABC News. Until one day, not just the black vans, but as we later learned, an armored FBI vehicle too, surrounded his suburban DC apartment, and this reporter's otherwise very public presence just vanished from public view. Many of those details we wouldn't learn until 6 months later in October, when reporter Tatiana Siegel, assigned to the story by Rolling Stone, published a piece confirming it was an FBI raid after consulting neighbors and working sources at ABC and within the government, but lacking definitive conclusions about why this reporter was swept away, leaving readers with still more questions and strong implications that there was some sort of government crackdown on journalism in play. The arrested journalist's name is James Gordon Meek. He had an accomplished career breaking major military and counterterrorism stories, like the Army's cover-up of a friendly fire case in Iraq in 2008. Likewise, he was a producer on a 2021 documentary exploring a military cover-up of the deaths of 4 Special Forces soldiers who were ambushed and killed in Africa in 2017. Meek was first to report the foiled al-Qaeda plot to bomb New York City tunnels in 2006. He was part of an ABC team that won an Emmy for its Pulse nightclub shooting coverage, and his career uncovering counterterrorism stories earned him a job as an investigator with the House Committee on Homeland Security. Meek had a long career of challenging powerful people, and a new book in the works that would have potentially challenged those currently in power. Working with a retired Green Beret, Meek had a deal with Simon & Schuster to publish a book called Operation Pineapple Express, the story of retired Green Berets who worked themselves to evacuate Afghan allies amid Biden's botched Afghanistan withdrawal. That book was still published in August, but only by Meek's co-author Scott Mann, after Meek abruptly withdrew from the project with timing corresponding with his arrest, and his name and image disappeared completely from book promotionals. Neighbors interviewed by the Rolling Stone reporter Siegel didn't know where Meek went. None of them had seen him or spoken with him since his disappearance. ABC colleagues also didn't know where he went, telling the reporter they had no idea what happened. Meek just fell off the earth, one coworker said, and people asked about him around the office, but nobody knew the answer. The best information the reporter could get from ABC was that Meek resigned very abruptly, and he hasn't worked there since his disappearance. The only information that neighbors could provide with certainty was the seriousness of the FBI raid that got him. One witness noted an armored tactical vehicle, multiple Arlington County police cruisers, multiple unmarked vehicles, and at least 10 heavily armed personnel, none of those agents apparently wearing any clear agency identification. The witness also noted the speed of the operation. The raid swept Meek away in only about 10 minutes. No resistance, no standoff, no shootout that the armored vehicle and the tactical loadouts would suggest was at least a plausible possibility. So with a disappeared journalist and no explanation for why, the Rolling Stone story went where your mind naturally might. Was this some sort of political retribution, some sort of censorship effort to get a guy who somebody powerful wanted to shut up? The Rolling Stone story said that after both Obama and Trump showed hostilities to critical reporters and sources, and despite Biden's pledge to end some of those excesses, this was possibly the first Biden raid on a journalist. Though, of course, James O'Keefe would like a word, or at least he offers a dance for your acknowledgement, having been raided by the FBI about half a year beforehand. But working sources further, this Rolling Stone reporter did get at least some substance for this government crackdown on journalism suspicion. One source cited in the story said that during the raid, the FBI found classified information on Meek's laptop, thus cementing the narrative that the story closed with. Meek was on the wrong side of the national security apparatus, and now, at least implicitly, he's rotting in some gulag for it. Now, of course, generally speaking, that inclination and skepticism is understandable and even healthy. When the government raids a reporter, insistent, demanding questions must be asked until the truth is uncovered, because the principles that raid potentially threatens aren't just at the heart of our constitution and legal system, they're at the heart of our ability to find truth by challenging power at all. But even though expecting the worst from government is a good starting assumption, it doesn't mean it's always right either. See, there are multiple ways to disappear inexplicably into an unmarked van. Getting on the wrong side of powerful DC politicians and bureaucrats surely could be one way, but another way is to be the sort of guy who would otherwise be luring kids into an unmarked van. The other way is to get caught committing a crime so heinous you're actually disappearing your own face from public view because of the rightful shame and disgrace that corresponds with that crime. And I will apply the word allegedly to that statement with emphasis. Like any other person accused, this disappeared reporter Meek is entitled to a presumption of innocence, but the nature of the accusation alone perfectly explains his abrupt disappearance from every association he ever had. In February, the charges and affidavit against Meek were unsealed, and it turns out the contents of his laptop were far worse than classified information. He is now charged with transportation of child pornography, the specifics of which are far too indecent even to describe verbally, but the affidavit alleges that, among other materials, the worst of it is a video of the youngest possible victim receiving the worst possible treatment, and some corresponding commentary about how amazing that sort of experience is. While he hasn't admitted guilt in any formal sense, Meek reportedly told investigators his life is now over. Meek was originally assigned to house arrest, but now prosecutors have successfully put him in jail pending trial, convincing a judge that Meek is a public risk because he was grooming minors, according to testimony from at least one minor victim. So unless there's some impossibly great explanation, unless the FBI planted this material or something like that and faked conversations as every guy on To Catch a Predator has ever desperately alleged, this is actually a case of a justified disappearance. It has nothing to do with abuse of government power. Instead, it's a case of abuse of adult power over children, a context that explains all of the factors for the initial suspicion: the aggressive arrest, the aggressive prosecution, and the total disappearance of the suspect. The problem is not necessarily that Rolling Stone got this story wrong based on a hunch, or more precisely, based on a skepticism of government power. Even if wrong in that suspicion, it'd still be the product of good journalistic instinct, though misapplied in this particular case. The problem is Rolling Stone knew the whole time. Rolling Stone was alleging government abuse, knowing it was actually child abuse, according to their own sources, before the publication of their initial story. New reporting in NPR breaks that story this week. The original story, the Rolling Stone reporter Tatiana Siegel wrote, quoted sources saying Meek had been raided over images of child sex abuse, but that particular piece of what happened was mysteriously deleted prior to publication. Well, if she knew it was a child sex abuse story, then how did she produce a story that omitted that fact and instead implied that government abuse was the explanation? Well, it was a combination of unfortunate circumstances and what appears to be opportunistic corruption. Immediately prior to publication, Siegel's mom became sick, so Siegel left work to be with her mother as she died. While Siegel was gone, her editor, Noah Shachtman, the editor of the entire Rolling Stone publication, made an unusual deviation from his typical process. He edited Siegel's story and removed all mention of child sex abuse, or even mentioned that the reason for the arrest was unrelated to Meek's journalistic work. And Shachtman softened the story not just in its word choices and allegations, but in its imagery too. According to documentation provided to NPR, Shachtman asked his staff for a photo of something generically, quote, FBI-y to use for the story's header, specifically saying they should not use a photo of the suspect, James Gordon Meek. And so the changes were made, the publish button was hit, and the story went live, all while the reporter who worked and wrote it was away with her dying mom. When that reporter returned to see these changes, She was very angry with the decisions, and she has since left to work at Rolling Stone's sister publication Variety instead. Neither the reporter Siegel nor the editor Schachtman are speaking publicly about this story, but NPR has assembled these facts by speaking with colleagues at Rolling Stone, as well as sources within ABC News and the Department of Justice. Okay, so why, though? Why is the guy who's leading a publication that's supposed to pry the truth from the iron grip of power being a pedo protector? Well, depends who you ask. Skeptics will note the Rolling Stone editor Schachtman and the accused reporter Meek had at least a cordial professional relationship. They were friendly peers, according to colleagues with similar backgrounds in national security journalism who traveled in the same professional circles, and the two had at least occasional social media interaction about personal interests as well. So it could be as simple as just a buddy protecting a buddy, though if that's the case, it's weird to push a story you know to be false without expecting the truth to come out eventually. It seems like it would make more strategic sense just to drop the story altogether if protecting your buddy was the aim, but maybe that would have been just too obvious. The editor Schachtman's side, at least according to these colleagues speaking with NPR, is that the original story that correctly identified child sex abuse as the cause for the arrest wasn't reliably sourced. Schachtman told others at Rolling Stone that he did not believe that the story's sourcing was nailed down adequately. Though of course it clearly was, as the sourcing proved to be correct. The reporter didn't guess that information. She gathered it from people in the know. And by the way, so did other reporters. The Daily Beast correctly identified the nature of the arrest the week after the Rolling Stone story was published, at least that the arrest had nothing to do with Meek's journalism. Of course, strictly vetting sources isn't itself a problem either for its own sake, but again, in this context, that's a principle that doesn't appear like it was universally applied. Because after all, the same sources told the reporter Siegel about the nature of Meek's arrest that was published. The same sources told her about the nature of his resignation. That was published. The same sources told her wrongly about the possibility of classified information on Meek's computer. That was apparently false information. That was still published. Why include only some of this information, but not the information that would later prove to be the most relevant? Well, maybe it was because that information was the most inflammatory. Perhaps that's what the Rolling Stone editor would say. After all, Rolling Stone paid millions in defamation lawsuits after a retracted 2014 story about a University of Virginia gang rape that never happened. So perhaps the edits to this story were made out of an abundance of caution not to be accusatory in an unsubstantiated way to avoid additional defamation liability. Sure, don't make unfounded accusations as a matter of journalistic ethics and as a matter of the law, but you can report findings without doing that. Sources say the arrest of James Gordon Meek is unrelated to his journalistic work. Serious charges otherwise possibly underway. That's an example of a non-defamatory headline option. You don't have to definitively accuse the guy of child sex abuse to inform readers about the nature of his arrests according to people who know the truth. And of course, the irony is that if Rolling Stone was looking to avoid making false accusations, they still made one. They at least implicitly accused the FBI and the Justice Department and the Biden administration of some sort of journalistic crackdown. Now, don't get me wrong, I will eagerly point to the many First Amendment betrayals of this administration, but this case clearly is not one. Yet Rolling Stone knowingly misled readers to believe that it was. And more ironic still, a story that was written to expose the corruption of the powerful actually inadvertently exposed its own, and that is, serendipitously, to the original reporter's credit. Even if her work was improperly altered to her dismay, the truth still exercised its habit of working its way through the obstacles installed by its enemies. Her work is now totally vindicated, and the boss who undercut her is likewise totally exposed. Plus, her story illustrated a crucially important point. When observing all the world's corruption, don't automatically assume it's the government's work. Powerful pedophiles do their fair share of it too. I'd say it's a coin flip of responsibility, but that would imply it's an either-or proposition. Much more commonly than I'm sure we realize, it's probably both and. Don't blame the government. It might have been a pedophile. And actually, Come to think of it, it might have been a government pedophile, the absolute wisest philosophy with which to navigate these degenerate times. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Parler, that is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chat in my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.